Okay, folks, it's another program of Live It Loud, and I have a treat for you, as I do every week, but I'm telling you, this is special. Eddie DeGarmo of DeGarmo Key. Eddie, it is a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you so much.
Well, it's great to be here, John. And I mean, what's happened to us? We're like radio guys now. It's respectable. What's going on?
Well, I don't know about respectable, buddy, but yes, if nothing else, it's good a chance for us to get back together and find out how God has used you in your life and being an icon of Christian music, period, but especially Christian music for this program. And I'm really interested to find out exactly how God did use you.
I can give you a pretty long answer on that one. So,
Well, we got some time. We got some time, buddy.
well, it's probably no secret that I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. But before Memphis, I was born in Detroit and lived there till I was 4. And my mother played piano in our little Baptist church in Detroit. And so she started me on piano lessons at the age of 3. And I just kind of took to it. And in those days, this is going to be a really strange connection here, but in those days, Liberace had a television show.
Yes, he did.
That was on, I think, pretty much every afternoon, and I would watch that show every day and was just so smitten by how he could play that piano. And so I just kind of threw myself into it.
You know, normally on this program, I go, well, let's go to, can you remember one of the songs? I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do it.
Don't do that.
I know.
But I still remember the first record I bought, and it's a bit of a funny title, but I was always a huge Ray Charles fan.
Oh, now that we can do.
Yeah.
Do you remember one of the songs that?
Well, the record I bought with my own money when I was 4 was "I Got a Woman." Imagine that one.
Oh boy.
But that's what I bought. And
Okay.
why I bought "I Got a Woman," I have no idea. But I would study Ray Charles and did a lot of my life. And after moving to Memphis, of course, we moved to the part of town where Graceland Mansion was, and lived almost across the street from it. And so we would ride the school bus by Graceland and see Elvis in his front yard riding his horses. And my dad's real estate office was in that. If anybody that's ever been there, there's kind of a tourist destination across the street now, and his real estate office was in that set of buildings. So I was there pretty much every day.
Wow.
Across the street from Graceland. And the good side of that is, you know, I actually trick-or-treated, oddly enough, from Elvis Presley.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing.
I hear he was a nice guy.
And he gave me a signed dollar bill, of which I proudly spent the very next day.
On candy.
On candy.
I got you. Okay.
And can't believe I did that, but I did. The good side of that is that it got me very interested in music. The bad side of that is I got probably more interested than I should have been, and I just kind of dedicated myself at the altar of rock and roll from a very early age. And, you know, you and I come from the same era, and so growing up in the 60s and the 70s and playing in rock bands and doing all that crazy weird and stuff.
Yes.
Dana and I were in a 10-piece soul band that signed our first contract with
Dana Keys.
Dana Key, I'm sorry. Signed our first contract with London Records and High Records, and we were 15.
Wow.
And it was a mainstream, you know, kind of a soul band. Funny thing
Yeah.
about that particular band is neither one of us sang.
Well, you both, let's face it, you're both amazing musicians, so that doesn't surprise me as much as you think.
Yeah, I played keyboards and he played guitar, and we had a horn section, and, you know, we would kind of model ourselves after the horn bands of that day, Sly and the Family Stone.
Which was very hot.
Chicago,
I mean, yeah, they were,
and coming
oh my
from
gosh.
Memphis, it was a kind of a hot commodity, and we played all around the countryside down there and on television shows. But as most kids that didn't know the Lord in those days, we got, you know, in a heap of mess,
Yep.
as you can imagine.
I can.
Not unnatural for
Nope.
for kids.
Nope.
It was right before my 18th birthday when I had a very dramatic lightning bolt, you know, decision placed in front of me by God, and I dedicated my life to Jesus.
Praise God.
And the odd part of that story is I actually went home that night. I played a gig the night before and went to a church service the next day and dedicated my life to Jesus, got convicted probably for the first time in my life.
And this is after going to church your whole life.
Oh, yeah.
You come from a very godly family.
Grew up Southern Baptist.
Absolutely.
And my divorce from the Baptist church was during my preteen years because I played in dance bands.
Oh, boy. Yes.
And
Yeah.
the Baptists, I mean, they don't dance.
No, they don't.
And so, but the Methodists did, and the other denominations did. And so, I went around, playing dances at other churches, but the Baptists wouldn't condone that sort of thing. So that was probably the beginning of my separation from the Baptist church, And I'm not knocking any of that today. I'm just saying that's what happened for me.
Right.
When I came to Christ, it was actually at an evangelistic service that was just coming through town. But I went home that night, John, and I'm not one that weeps too often, but I cried that night, but not for the reasons that you think. I cried because I thought God was going to make me quit my band. And
That's because that's what we were taught.
I had dedicated my whole life, to playing music in a band, and we were signed, and we were making a record, and thought we were on our way, and we were on the radio a little bit and on TV. And I just thought God was going to make me quit my band, of which ultimately that's what happened, but I was tore up about it.
Right.
I look back on that now, and I thank the Lord that he had as much mercy as he did in my life, because I was pretty much an ungrateful twit, and I had just become a Christian, 3 hours before that. I just went home, and I was upset, and I was thinking to myself, my gosh, what have I done in my life? I've dedicated my entire existence to making it music. I'm on the verge of doing it, and now God has messed everything up.
How did it turn out?
Well, it turned out better than any could imagine.
Yep.
I went back to school. I was right before we graduated high school.
So did you quit the band?
It was about a 3-month journey there.
No kidding.
Yeah, and I'll tell you that story because it's got a pretty funny, ironic story too. I went to school the next day, and I saw Dana Key walking down the hallway, and he asked me a question. He said, we were all out at the park yesterday, and I saw you, but you didn't party with us. What's going on? And I said, well, I went to a church service, and I got to tell you, I found Jesus. And Dana's answer to me was, well, I didn't know he was missing. That's what he said right back to me. So we actually skipped school. I'd only been a Christian for a day. I didn't know you weren't supposed to do that. We skipped school, and I went and witnessed to him, and Dana gave his life to the Lord while we skipped school. And we went back to band practice. That was a Monday. We went on Monday night, and I shared the same story with our bandmates, kind of the same way, and it kind of went over like the Hindenburg. It did not go over well. And so the tension started in the band pretty immediately. Just, do I feel good about playing this song or playing that song? And we were, as kids that don't know Christ we were pretty risque, and, but that's normal, And so I didn't feel comfortable with that anymore. And you asked me about quitting the band.
Right.
That came about 3 or 4 months later, but the story is pretty telling. There was an enlisted men's club on a naval base north of Memphis that we would play at fairly often. And we were playing at this club, and it was always a kind of a fun night because there'd be like 300 guys and frankly like 10 girls or something, And the guys would just cut up and probably drink more than they should and all that. But they were just kids, and it was the Vietnam War, and, it was all that era. Mm-hmm. Well, the fellow that led me to the Lord, I invited him to go with me that night. And so he was sitting next to me, and I forgot about something that we had done every time we had played there, is they would clear the chairs from the dance floor about halfway through the second set, and the sailors would sit up in a semicircle, and girls would come out and do a striptease. And so they came out from the back, and we were playing Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs, and normally we would play it like 10 minutes long, and these girls would come out and start doing that. And I was sitting on my Hammond organ bench, looking at this fellow that led me to the Lord, and at the same time looking out at the dance floor. And that's when it became very clear to me that something was not right. And I had to address it. So
Wow.
the next day I went to the band and said, guys, I said, I love you guys, but, my life has changed and I just can't stay. So
Well, did Dana do the same thing?
he did. He did the very same thing at the same time.
Wow.
Yep. And that night was kind of our epiphany.
Wow.
That, more or less told us that things were different.
And this is as an 18-year-old boy.
Yep.
I'll tell you what, that was mighty grown up and mighty Christ-centered. Praise God.
Well, we didn't, I like to use the phrase, we were rebels without a clue. And we kind of were. And then to continue the story, starting in Christian music was never an intentional thing that happened.
A lot of times it's not. It's very it surprises me. Our stories are a lot of times very parallel.
Well, this was, 1972 maybe in Memphis, and we didn't know anything about any Christian music other than maybe Southern gospel music,
Well, nothing existed until you guys showed up.
Well, there might have been a few like Larry Norman or a couple of those guys on the West Coast, but we didn't know anything about them.
Right. Right.
And we didn't know about Petra. It was before their first album came out, and so Dana and I just started writing songs about what God had done in our lives, and we would get together and play them, and soon we found a drummer that would play with us. We couldn't find a bass player, and so I played bass with my feet on my Hammond organ at first, kind of like Felix Cavalieri did in the Rascals, right?
Yeah.
And we were a three-piece, and then we found another guitar player that came on board, and we would just write songs about what God had done. We couldn't find any place to play, because nobody would want us much, and then and the only places we knew to play were kind of bars and clubs and dances and stuff. So we booked a couple of those and went out and played, and that was a wonderful experience, but probably not for the reasons that you're thinking. I learned really early in my career that when you're on a stage in a nightclub, there's not a lot of people that are receptive to hear the message about Christ.
Surprise.
For one reason or another, And so, through the years, I know we don't want to get into this, but I've worked with a lot of young artists that want to reach a mainstream audience, and I understand that, but I always tell them, I said, well, if you're thinking about using your platform, I'm not sure that works. I think you'd be better off to sit on a bar stool and tell people one-on-one about Jesus than you would to try to do it on a stage.
Amen. Yeah.
It's kind of like playing basketball in the sanctuary on Sunday morning. They just don't go together.
Right. Well, darkness doesn't want to hear the light.
Yeah. So, but we played at some clubs and we got thrown out of a few.
Yep. Yeah.
And then we tried playing at some churches and we got thrown out of those. It was kind of the same thing. So we couldn't find any place to play.
I don't know if people realized the pioneers in Christian rock. It was everybody hated you.
Well, the church, and in fact, the TV preachers started preaching about us. And I'll tell you, the fellow that signed us in our mainstream band before that, he was a really good fellow. His name was Lewis Willis. He owned a big old recording studio in the ghetto in downtown Memphis. And he allowed Dana and I in our first, we didn't know what it was, but our first Christian music group, Jesus, to practice there. And it was a big open room that used to be some sort of facility, store or something, And the young people around town started hearing about the Christian band that would practice. And, just word of mouth, total word of mouth.
Right.
And then there was a TV preacher that talked about us one Sunday negatively, and that actually worked to get the word out. And these kids would come to our rehearsal, and, it was a big room, and a lot of times we would have a couple hundred kids in there.
Just at your rehearsals?
At our rehearsals. And we only knew 5 or 6 songs. And we would play them and share and preach and pray and testify. And then somebody brought a coffee pot one day, and before you know it, we didn't realize it, but we kind of had started our own coffee house in this old recording studio in the ghetto in downtown Memphis. we would practice once a week, and the kids around town just heard about it and figured it out, and that became our home base to play out of.
How old were you at this time?
I was probably still 18.
Really? That happened that fast?
Yeah, it happened that fast.
Okay.
I mean, I became a believer in the spring. I left the band probably midsummer. Around the same time, Dana and I and our drummer moved into a one-bedroom apartment kind of in the rough part of town in Memphis. And, I mean, our room looked like a little army barracks. And we started writing these songs, these Christian songs, not really understanding what we were doing.
But it's from your heart. You were a writer. You both were writers, and you were writing about what was important to you.
Which is what writers do.
Exactly.
Whether it's, hip-hop writing on street stuff or girls in cars like they did in the 60s or whatever, it's just writers write about what's important to them.
I think true Christian writers, people don't realize that no matter what music style it is, it's still the most important subject in your life. And why would you want to write about anything else?
Well, you wouldn't. And in the early years, John, we took a lot of criticism from a lot of folks about rock music.
Oh, gosh, yes.
But the interesting thing about that, it was never intentional.
Right.
It's just the kind of music we grew up on.
It was our style.
It was natural.
Our language. And I see music is a language. Eddie, I know I'm preaching to the choir here.
Right.
Music is our language. And we chose rock because, if nothing else, it's an exciting music form.
Yeah, and we didn't, I wouldn't have known how to do anything else.
Exactly.
It just kind of came out that way.
Yeah, God designed us for that style.
And so we started writing these songs, and then, the church in those days in Memphis was really up in arms, mostly, speaking out against what we were doing. And the downside of that is, as a young person, some of that stuff would hurt, but the upside of that is that was definitely the publicity engine.
Yep.
Because the newspaper started writing about it, and then the little radio stations down there started wanting to play our music, and it just kind of lit up the countryside. And anytime something crazy would happen, because there were a few crazy things that happened. We had tomatoes thrown at us and, got kicked out of 2 or 3 very well-known Christian universities. Kicked out, unplugged, and told to leave.
I love it.
And
I don't love it, but I totally can relate.
And places that I've been back to and played concerts, 10 years later or 20 years later. But but every time one of those incidents would happen, God would use that negative publicity for good. And that's the way the word started getting around just the Mid-South, that there was a Christian rock band.
There was a hunger in the youth for their language to talk about Christ.
That's what it was.
It was one of those things where, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, this is just what I've discovered too, is the kids were hungry for real, for Christ. But they didn't want to go to church because it wasn't their style. And for us to be able, for God to allow us to talk in a language, to play in a language that they understood and use it that way, was just a total honor.
Well, and then the actual starting of the career kind of came a total backwards way as well. We never knew there could be a career. We never even thought about that, really. And
what did you think you were going to do?
Well, I actually put all my stuff up for sale once because the criticism got so heavy. I was like, well, God, can this be right? I don't know. And, I'm going to put a fleece out, as some of the Christians would call it, and see if I can sell my instruments. I couldn't sell anything. Couldn't sell a single thing. So Susan, my lovely wife now of 40, soon be 44 years, Susan came to one of our band practices and became a believer at one of our band practices. And so she had a real heart for what I did because, how it impacted her own life early on. And Susan's uncle is kind of a legendary guy. He's passed away now, but he was an old blues guy out of Memphis named Jim Dickinson. And Jim Dickinson played with the Rolling Stones. He was their keyboard player, played on some of their records. Played the piano solo on Arlo Guthrie's City of New Orleans, and he was one of those kind of guys, produced kind of one of the first alternative rock bands called Big Star that was very well known back in the day.
Yeah.
Reproduced another group called The Replacements. Jim was Susan's uncle, and I met him right after we were married at their Christmas party, family Christmas party, and we kind of both looked like animals in the middle of a social scene, so we hit it off. And I started talking to him about High and Stax and London Records and all that, and he was telling me about all the stuff he was doing. And he said, "So what are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, we're playing Jesus rock music." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, we're playing Jesus rock music." And he goes, "I want to record you." He said, "That's the most out thing I've ever heard."
It takes those kind of people, doesn't it?
And so he took us in the studio, and we made 4 demos. And those 4 demos really weren't the ones that got us started, but they were the beginning of what became to be the ones that got us started. Mm-hmm. And I played those demos for a friend of mine that had come to Memphis that worked for a big magazine in those days called Campus Life magazine.
Oh, yeah.
And I was working for Campus Life doing their high school work, and so was Dana. And this fellow's name is Steve Lawhead, and he was their music critic. And he came to Memphis, oddly enough, to do a story on another kid in one of our programs that kind of had a pretty crazy story himself, and ended up staying with Susan and I. Uh-huh. And I played him those 4 demos. And we kind of hit it off, and he wanted to hear about music, and so I played them for him. And he said, "I think there's something here." And I didn't know he was the music critic for the magazine, but they were a very well-known magazine in those days. And Steve, he called me back a week or 2 later, and he said, this stuff is good, but he said, "I really think you guys got it in you to do something better." And so we borrowed $300 from Youth Through Christ and went back in the studio with our former mainstream manager. Lewis Willis was his name, and said, "Lewis, all we got is $300. Can you help us?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll help you." And so we spent a week in the studio with him and made 7 demos and sent them to Steve and sent them out to all the different record companies, which, I'd finally just become aware of Christian music.
Most down to Texas.
Yeah.
Down to Waco.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And sent them to Waco and different places. And Petra's first album had come out by then, and so we had heard the very first record, had heard Larry Norman's record, but that was about it,
Yes.
in those days. Maybe somebody played us Terry Talbot or something,
Yeah.
And we sent those demos around and got passed on pretty much by everybody. It was either too preachy, too rock, too this, too that, and we were a blues rock band, which was a little different for the day. And so one day the phone rings, and Susan picks up the phone and answers it, and she hangs it up. And I said, "Well, who was that?" And she said it was this guy that said he was Pat Boone. And for those of you, Pat's, he's not been totally in the limelight the last few years, but in that period of time, he was still on The Tonight Show and doing movies and stuff, and
He was a major Christian connection to the world.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
In the early 70s.
Absolutely.
So the phone rang again, and I answered it, and he said, "Is this Eddie DeGarmo?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Please don't hang up. Don't hang up." He said, "I lost somebody hang up, or I lost connection." He said, "But I'm Pat Boone." And he said, "I have a copy here of a tape that's got your name and number written in a magic marker on the side of it." And he said, "I don't even know how I got it." And he said, "But you know what? I think I can help you."
Wow.
And we talked for 15 or 20 minutes on the phone, and he asked if he could come and visit us in Memphis the next couple days. And so his son-in-law came, and Pat Boone had a little record company with another fellow named Mike Curb.
Oh, jeez. A little record company.
Yeah.
That changed a little bit later.
Yeah, and it was called Lamb and Lion Records in those days. Pat was the lamb and Mike was the lion, supposedly. And so we ended up signing a record contract with those guys and made our first couple records for them. And, you know, we were off and running, but that's the story. So, you know, if people say, well, how did you get signed? I said, well, just don't hang up the phone.
Oh man, I could tell you another story that's close to that with me.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Because it's hard to believe that anybody would take you serious.
Yeah.
Because you're fighting it all the time.
But you just, you know, we were just making our way.
Yes.
And you have to just do it.
Yeah.
Like the Nike people say, you know, you just have to do it.
Just do it.
If God has called you to do something, no matter what it is,
Amen.
just do it.
Amen.
And don't worry about how big it is or how big a platform it is or whatever, but just, you got to do it.
Okay,
You know?
you do. Hey, listen. Okay, now you're on your first record.
Yep.
Okay, when did you start touring?
We toured that record, our first tour, which was, oh my gosh, you talk about a series of misadventures.
Oh, buddy.
You know,
Go to churches, they kick you out because they didn't know you were that way.
well, our first tour was all the way out to California and up the West Coast and down the West Coast. And, you know, we were touring in old, raggedy, beat-up vehicles and trucks that broke down all the time, and saw a lot of miracles with that stuff. And, you know, missed a concert because we were broken down, and the folks from the church actually came to the Motel 6, and we played in our motel room. And
No way.
there were about 60 people in this little motel room.
Oh,
And we did the whole best we could.
wow.
You know, did our concert in the Motel 6 room in Fresno. Pulled up to one concert, I never will forget this, and we crawled out of that old truck. And this lady came up, and she was real friendly, but she said, when do you think the band's going to get here? Well, this is us.
Thank you.
Had our first episode with a Christian radio station, which is just funny beyond belief. It was a big station in Seattle, Washington, and I think they're still around, but they were big in those days. And our record label had set us up an interview with them, and it was obvious when we got there that they had never heard our music.
Yes.
And so we took an album in, and we were playing in town that night, and so we talked to the DJ a little bit about the concert for a second and told him we were from Memphis and this and that. And he said, can I play a song? And I said, well, yeah, man, we'd love to. And so we gave him the album, and it was in those days they would actually spin records on turntables and radio stations. And he put the record on the turntable and started it. And it played about maybe 30 seconds, maybe not even that long. And he actually reached over me and hit the needle with his arm, and it skidded all the way across the album on the air. You know how it sounds?
Yes.
On the air. Well, that was DeMarco and Key. Now to a message from our sponsors. And that was our first radio interview.
Yep.
And so we were like, wow, what has happened here? And then that night, I mean, this, you know, in those days, this is so far back in Christian music, when you would play, normally it'd just be the house lights on. You didn't have stage lighting,
Right.
you know,
Right.
like we've grown accustomed to.
Right.
But these people that night had brought in a couple of those light trees.
Light towers, yeah.
Yeah, light towers. And maybe that was the first time we ever had stage lighting. And you wouldn't believe what happened. Those lights came on, and that crowd just freaked out. About half of them were for it, and about half of them were against it. And these, you know, well-meaning folks after
Yes.
the concert accosted me and Dana, and somebody had a fog machine or whatever, and she got in my face, this lady, I'll never forget. She goes, I could see the demons rising up from the back, from the smoke through those lights while y'all were playing, and, you know, and how dare you do this in the name of God? And I said back to her, I said, well, I thought that was just our drummer. And she got really angry. I probably shouldn't have said that. But those kind of things would happen in those years in Christian music. And, you know, as much as I make a big deal about that, there was way more people that were for us than were against us.
But it seems like the ones that were against were louder.
Well, they are.
Yeah.
They just always, they call them the vocal minority. I mean, we even see that in our political world today.
Gosh, yes,
You know,
absolutely.
it's just there's a small group of people that are always the opposition force,
And
they
they're always the loudest.
make a lot of noise.
Yeah, sure do, buddy.
They sure do. And so we experienced a lot of that in the early days. But as time went on, you know, and we were what I call bivocational, meaning that normally what would happen on our first tours for the first couple years is we would go out and come back home with more bills than we left town
Oh,
with,
gosh, yes. Yep.
you know, and
Yes.
then we would work to pay the bills off.
Yep.
And I was pretty good with my hands in those days, and I could build things and paint things and you name it. I could do all that stuff. My dad was a home builder, so I learned all that.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I was a handyman, and, you know, would build houses, and I'd do anything, you know, build you a porch, paint you a kitchen, whatever it took to try to figure out a way to put food on the table while we were
And
going out.
you had a family by this time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was married, and by that time had 2 children.
Wow.
When we made our first album, Susan and I mean, I like to say we were married about 9 months and 15 minutes when our first came. Maybe 10 minutes. So, but it wasn't very long.
I got you.
She's counted the days to make sure she was legit, and she was. But we had children right off the bat.
Wow.
And, you know, that's a whole nother story